Welcome, everyone, to tonight's session of ReggieCon, where we're going to feature Soldiers Unknown in celebration of Native American Heritage Month. This is our third ReggieCon panel for the semester, but don't worry, we have many more to come, so be on the lookout for our future panels. My name is Jana Albrecht. I'm the Associate Vice President for Enrollment Management here at Illinois State University. Before we begin the panel, I go through a few details just to keep all of us running smoothly, especially for those of you in the audience. First, we do record the session and we'll post it to the ReggieCon website so you can view that at any time. Second, if you need confirmation of attendance tonight, we'll go ahead and post a link towards the end of the panel so you can complete those. And then third, the presenter's video and audio are on, but none of us can hear or see any of you as guests. So that said, we do monitor that Q&A function, and we encourage you to ask those questions right away if you have them early and often. It's one of the panelists' favorite things to do. So they will get to your question. Just know that it may not be right away. They will get to it. So last update, and it's just a reminder to check our ReggieCon website for future panels, or even if you want to view our old panels. There are some really good ones out there. So enough of the housekeeping. At this time, I am pleased to introduce our fearless leader, Dr. Scott Jordan. Dr. Jordan is the chair of psychology here at Illinois State, and he also happens to be our moderator and a panelist for tonight's discussion. Scott, please take it away.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Albrecht. And welcome everyone to ReggieCon, the con that asks the question, what's your story? I'm Dr. Scott Jordan, aka Zombie Scotty. I'm a cognitive psychologist philosopher here at Illinois State University. And tonight we come together to celebrate Native American Heritage Month with a discussion of Chag Lowry's amazing graphic novel, Soldiers Unknown. Now, before we get into this amazing discussion, the first thing I always need to do is just thank those people behind the scenes who make us look like we know what we're doing. So, of course, special thanks goes to Dr. Jana Albrecht from Enrollment Management and Academic Services, Mr. Sean Thornton, who does all of the amazing artwork you see on ReggieCon flyers, Mrs. Danny Schroeder, who also comes from marketing, Ms. Somer Simmons, who is behind the scenes making sure students get credit for all of what they're doing here, as well as sending out Zoom links to panelists and such. And of course, Ms. Kelly Harmon from the Department of Psychology, who helps everyone make sure things work well. And welcoming Ms. Julie Manaye Perez to the team. She works in marketing as well. So I want to thank all of them for everything that they do. And now what I want to do is introduce who's going to be here tonight. First, I'd like to introduce my partner in all crime and all things nerdy, Dr. Eric Wesselmann. Eric, please come on in and tell the audience a little something about who you are and what you do.
I'm a professor of psychology at ISU. I focus a lot of my work on the dynamics of social inclusion and exclusion in daily life, but I'm also a big fan of pop culture and using pop culture to teach psychology, and I just love having nerdy conversations.
Fantastic. Also joining the panel this evening, graduate student at Illinois State University, Miss Maisha Tahsin Orthy. Maisha, please come on in the room, tell everybody a little something about who you are and what you do.
Hello, I actually don't know if I am in the room or something, but
you're in the room. We're good.
Okay, cool. Okay, I am pretty new to this, so yeah. As Dr. Scott Jordan already told us, I am a master's student. I'm a second-year master's student at Illinois State University. I'm studying cognitive and experimental psychology and quantitative psychology and a lot of this stuff. But I am I call myself a self-proclaimed pop culture nerd who kind of consumes every kind of pop culture that existed. And I'm very excited to talk about these things because I think pop culture is a great way to tell stories about difficult concepts, which might be very hard to understand for some people. So pop culture is a way to go because it gives us relevant context to talk about.
Fantastic. So glad you're here.
Thank you.
Also joining tonight's discussion is storyteller illustrator, Mr. Dale Deforest. Dale, please come on into the Zoom room and tell the audience a little something about who you are and what you do.
You said it. I'm an illustrator and storyteller, and I've been doing this for as long as I can remember. And apart from that, I don't know what else to add. I mean, I can talk about my education, but it's nothing compared to the caliber in this room,
Please, life is education, man, right? And we all live our way through a certain space, and mine ended up being what it was. Yours ended up being what it was. There you go.
I did go to a tribal arts school, the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe, New Mexico.
Fantastic.
And I got my degree there in photography of all things, which I think sort of lent itself to the framing of the storytelling, if that makes any sense.
That makes perfect sense.
I'm here in New Mexico, and I'm loving every minute.
Well, we're so glad you're here. Thanks again for accepting the invitation. And now, ladies and gentlemen, and everyone, it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's special guest, author of Soldiers Unknown, Chag Lowry. Chag, please come into the room, tell the audience a little something about who you are and what you do.
I thank you very much for having me. It's an honor to be here and to share about my work. And it's always awesome to be on a panel with Dale. I really admire his art and his writing. And so a little bit about myself. I work at UC San Diego in the School of Public Health. My passion work is comics and the graphic novel that you mentioned, Soldiers Unknown. From my background on my mother's side, I'm of Yurok Native ancestry from northwestern California. And then on my father's, I am descended from the Maidu and the Achumawi cultures. Those two cultures are from northeastern California.
Well, we're absolutely delighted you accepted the invitation, and we can't wait to talk about this magnificent piece of work. So let me explain how we do things here on ReggieCon. What I've asked each of the panelists to do is pick their favorite frame from the graphic novel. I have it here. I'll share it. They'll tell everyone why it's their favorite frame. And then we'll all talk about why we love it and talk about what we think it teaches us as we celebrate Native American Heritage Month. However, before we begin sharing our favorite frames, I do have a question for Chag. And the reason is because we're also celebrating, Veterans Day in November, right? And I don't know. Let me just say this. I'm an age, and I don't know too much about the War of 1812, but I do know stuff about World War I. It was prominent in my education when I was younger, and I don't know how prominent it is now. One of the things that I was just stunned by is how clearly you captured the pure carnage of World War I. World War I was the second major war that involved the rifled barrel plus the machine gun. So the old tactics of lining up and marching towards the enemy were things that basically led to casualty numbers that were just previously unfathomable. So you mentioned in the introduction to your graphic novel that it's based on a true story. Can you tell us how you came upon this story, as well as the investigative work you did to try to contextualize the different experiences going on in Soldiers Unknown?
Thank you for that context. So I was raised around my grandfather's generation, which are the World War II generation. And I actually conducted a number of interviews, starting with my late grandfather. And over the course of a couple of years, interviewed about 60 World War II vets from Native cultures throughout Northern California. And one thing that they would often mention when we were talking about their time in the service is a lot of them would say, oh, my dad or my older brother was in the First World War. And they would bring out these amazing photographs often. And there were a number of Yurok families that shared their family members' service photos. And so that really inspired me to learn more about, here's another conflict and that our people were part of. And for California Native people, World War I was the first experience being a part of the U.S. military, as opposed to being hunted by the U.S. military, which was, 1 or 2 generations prior. So that always fascinated me too, because, World War I is not that far back in our history, really. And so after that, thinking about, those real life stories that the family members shared. And then I have two great uncles that served and fought in the war on my Iraq side. So that's what inspired me. And then a lot of reading and research. And it is historical fiction. So the book is revolves around the real life 91st Infantry Division, which the majority of California men, regardless of culture, who served and fought in the war, were in this one division. And then the Meuse-Argonne offensive battle was, which is the largest American Army battle still in history, which most people know nothing about. I didn't know anything about it until I started to read. And so it's about the first couple days of that battle.
Yeah. Does anyone want to follow up on Chag's comment there, or my question, or anything along those lines? That's perfectly fine. I truly appreciate you giving us that understanding, because I was particularly struck by the end of the story when we're talking about the experiences of veterans and the sort of transhuman nature of, post-traumatic stress and the actual inability to express it in relation to people who haven't been there. So I very much appreciate your commitment to that. And here's what we're going to do now. I'm going to share Eric's first frame. Eric has two frames. So Eric, I believe this one is yours. Can you see that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, so the two different pages that I picked were moments that in my mind were conceptually linked. We'll start here with the first one, before our main characters go off to war, and we have Thomas here, who we start with this sort of, if we just go from the top to the bottom, right? We start with, in using sort of photography or film type lingo, we have these kind of a close-up of objects, which is an interesting way to sort of start the scene, if you will. And then there's an immediate pull back to an establishing shot, where we have these characters interacting, and then it goes back into some close-ups. Thomas's father gives him this object, and of course it's wrapped up so it's disguised from the audience, and we get this wonderful close-up of Thomas's face looking at the object, and we see this sort of intimidation, this concern, this sort of mixed sense of emotions, but we don't know what he's looking at, right? Until that last panel where we get the sort of reaction shot from his point of view, and it's this knife, and he's just been told, basically, you're going to have to kill people, right? Because they're going to kill you. So it's one way or the other. And just me sort of perspective taking, putting myself in Thomas's shoes, I felt really overwhelmed is the best way that I can describe what that must be like to be in that situation, right? They were drafted, right? It wasn't like, he came in and sort of was like, I know what it is to be in the military and I'm choosing to do this. It's most people drafted, they're just kind of thrust into this conflict that they have to just sort of navigate. So that was the first moment. And then we have several moments with Thomas throughout this. But this one,
by the way, quick trigger warning to anybody in the audience. A lot of violence in this graphic novel. I would argue it's extremely story relevant because capturing the horror, face-to-face horror of World War I is important. So I didn't mean to interrupt, Eric. I just realized I probably should have given a trigger warning to start. Go ahead.
Yeah, and so then, throughout this story, Thomas and the other characters have to increasingly engage in violence. And as Scott already mentioned, that's part of the narrative arc here. And what struck me about this page was the initial composition of, you've got sort of the traditional 3x3 old school comics grid, with starting with a bunch of action shots, but then you get this zoom in on the top upper right, where the knife becomes visually there. Then you have that middle row where you've got the three panels next to each other, but Thomas sort of breaks the gutters on that, right? Which is we haven't seen much of that up till this point in the narrative. And so typically when the comic scholars argue that when you sort of have a single image broken by gutters, as we read through those, that's sort of meant to denotate some type of time. In this case, it's sort of symbolic time, right? Because this is one moment, but there is this sort of almost like, I mean, this might be the slow-mo equivalent in comics. And not only is he breaking those gutters, but we have this symbolic background, right? Before then, we had a realistic background. And here it's just one color that is emotional, right? And of course, the red we see before that is the blood. Then it cuts down to a more traditional set of panels again, but you still now also have breaking of the gutters with the German soldiers exclamation, and then that moment where the two of them are about to attack each other and they're both breaking the gutter. And I felt this scene is very, very powerful. And again, sort of showing that Thomas went from being very, very hesitant at a couple of moments to this moment where he has to engage in violence. And then at the end, in the sort of coda, we have the narrator telling the audience as best they can what this does to folks. And, you know, as Scott mentioned earlier, I do a little bit of work with veterans and their feelings of inclusion and exclusion and helpful and unhelpful social support. And both in the quantitative and qualitative data, this discussion of violence, and not just what happens to them or to people close to them in terms of threat, but the things that they feel like they had to do to survive, is a big part of that trauma. So just narratively, structurally, conceptually, those moments really struck me.
Wow.
Chag, did you want to respond?
Yeah, that's I really deeply appreciate your what you felt and what you how you looked at the construction of the pages. I do want to say a big thank you to the artist, is Rasan Ekadal. He and I worked on this for 3.5 years. That's how long it took to create the book. That first set of panels on that page. So Thomas was the one of the three characters who was of mixed ancestry. So his father was white and his mother was Yurok. And a lot of the elders told me at that time that's when intermarriage first happened amongst the Yurok community. And so in the story, Thomas, you'll see that red background a couple of times, I think, with him, where he's caught in that in between, between the cultures. And so he carries a lot of anger at that. And so, and I did want to, show the Civil War, his father's the veteran, because that often happens in families too, right? At this point, you have generations of veterans in a family, and what do they give, or how do they talk to someone who's going into the service? And so for Thomas, his father gives him this intensely personal hand-to-hand combat weapon, and then the other two young men, they get something different. Charlie gets the sweat house, the traditional redwood plank sweat house, and the good medicine from that. And Morek visits with his younger sister. And so each of the three characters, I wanted to honor the real life stories that I was told by, my native family and community members. Like when they went off, how did their families, what was their last, meeting time, or what did they last tell them before they went into the service? And then, I very much appreciate your insights on that second page where the combat, the war is, especially World War I, was extremely graphic. The violence was intense, and it was, although artillery was the main killer of soldiers, there was also an intense up close combat experiences, which is different, what I've been told, what I learned, and really wanted to convey that. But again, in the context of, that it was a fight, and I'm sure those German characters, they didn't really want to be there either, right? That you're forced to do it. And the breaking of the gutters, and that was collaborative between Rasan and I. And he is a dynamic, an amazing artist to have worked with. Quite an honor.
I do want to follow up on Eric's comments about this frame. One of the ways I love the way that objects are used here is it's that knife that sort of combines the different time scales all the way from the Civil War up to the way to World War I. And, we have a tendency to look at objects as material things that contain no meaning. And I would argue that's just not the case. And you're actually sharing an experience. He's sharing an experience here by getting that knife. He's probably never talked with this person like that before in his life. But given now what's at stake, you're invited into this very personal part of a person's life where you've never spoken. And, we quite often don't like to talk about violence. We quite often don't like to talk about the fact that people took people's lives. And at the same time, we have standing armies, and we have standing armies for a reason. And I just appreciate the honesty here. This is going to be violent. And this object is going to move all the way from the Civil War to World War I through a family. And I think that's, I appreciate the treatment of the object, if that makes any sense. I think that's a really good way to tie things together. Does anyone else want to comment on one of these two pages? All righty, then, no problemo. We will go on to Maisha's page. Or pages.
Okay. Because it was like a 2-page spread, so I took a photo from that side so that it's clear. Okay, first of all, before I talk about the pages I picked out, I want to talk about the graphic novel a bit more, because it was very hard to read. Not because it was amazing graphic novel, but it was so violent and so close to history, and so close to, like, it's very human. It took me, like, I read like 2 pages, then I had to stop, then I read again, because it was just affecting me so much. So it was amazing. And I want to share some of like my personal stuff here, because I'm not American, and I didn't grow up here. I came from a country in South Asia. I'm from Bangladesh, and we have a lot of history about war. First of all, the World War II. Our country was a British colony of the British people, so England and stuff. So during the World War II, the way you portrayed here, the way the history happened to the Native American people, that they, even if they were not giving the right to be in the land, they were still had to be part of the war. It was kind of like similar in our people in the Indian subcontinent, that like, because British was colonizing us, so during the World War II, people from our country had to be part of the war. So I was kind of like, I did not have that much history knowledge regarding World War One, but my knowledge comes from World War Two, and I was kind of like relating both of this together, and I was like, okay, history is just repeating itself, and history is like so connected. War in everywhere is like just violent, and people who don't really maybe care, or who doesn't even want to fight, they have to be there fighting for other people who are in the power. So that's what I was feeling when I was reading that. So, and the reason I picked this up is because it's because I liked the frogs here, and I am not going to be able to talk about in a very sophisticated tone the way Eric did, or maybe Dr. Jordan is going to talk about. I'm just going to say that the reason I picked it is because I see the frog as like independent and have the freedom, who can move from here to another. And here we see the character who just doesn't have the right to be in the land. The frog can live in their land. I mean, I know the frogs or any animal, we still capture them and we still kill them and everything, but still I don't think they like deal with this stuff that this character had to go through. Like, they have the right to move from this land to that land, from this place, maybe from land to water to land, and jump from here to another place. But the Native American people who didn't have the right to even live on this land, but they had to fight. They had to do whatever the people there were, Caucasian people, were telling them to do. So that's kind of what I felt like in this thing. And I just kind of like see the way the artist drew the pages. Like, you can see he was like giving up hope. Then he sees the frog. Then he wants to try capture the frog. Then he couldn't do it. And then he again gets kind of like go through a despair. So this is why I picked the frame, honestly, because I really liked how it was portraying the whole thing. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your observations and thoughts. I appreciate them very much.
Thank
and
you.
for sharing, your cultural and historical, perspective on these images. And it is, in World War One, which was, the American involvement was 1917, 1918. Native American men were not U.S. citizens at that time. So, the fact that, and that always just kind of blows my mind. Technically, legally, did they even have to go? I mean, could it? That's kind of, to me, that's an open question. But they did. They went, right? And they fought. Now, this particular scene is, so the frog is very important in Yurok culture, my mother's people. And I thought how I could bring her in. And that's the other thing, is frog is female. And I put her in this part because she's guiding him out of no man's land. And I always, the whole concept of no man's land, what is that? And to me, it's very symbolic of the fact that, too many times when you have governments and decision makers that are all men, and you're missing the women's perspective, there's no balance. And so Frog was female to guide him. And then, so Charlie, this is Charlie, the main character, he was being trained because his people saw that he could move between, move between worlds, from, and Frog is, only he saw her, right? She only appeared to him. And that happens a couple times in the story where he sees certain images. And so her imprints that she leaves, that's a very well-used basketry design, and it's called the frog hand design. It's a beautiful basketry symbol, and I wanted to show, that which Rasan did beautifully. And then she's leading him to water. And so how I, in the course of my research, because I wanted to put frog in, but like how could it fit? So I read this little article about there was so much poison gas used in the war that it saturated the ground where the men were, and the men were dying of thirst often in no man's land. And if they drank the water that had the poison in it, they either killed them or it slowly killed them. So in this article, it said the men would look if there were any frogs or anything living in these puddles of water, then they knew they could drink from it and not die. And so that's what inspired me. And I thought, okay, this is how I can bring frog in to this story, because there were frogs there and they did guide people. But I wanted it to be from our cultural lens, the Iraq cultural lens. So, and I very much appreciate, again, that, your thoughts on it. And Dale, I'm curious, because I know you use cultural imagery, from your people's stories. Now, how do you go about doing that? What helps guide you when you incorporate your indigenous perspective into your work?
Oh, first off, I think it's hard for me to create anything that doesn't have a piece of my culture and background in everything that I do. But if I was to tell a story like this, I have no idea how I would approach it, apart from just taking some accounts of some people who were actually there and try to see it through their eyes, And then, but I do have some uncles that served in Vietnam and saw combat and came back extremely wounded, and part of me wanted to tell their story too. But, I thought that upon talking to one of my uncles, he didn't feel like he was in a good place to tell his story, And then he had just lost his son a few months prior. And I felt like if I were to talk to him about it, it'd be, removing yet another scar, or just exposing another scar that he wasn't ready to visit. But in terms of incorporating culture, it's one of those things that I just kind of do. That just comes naturally, because it's such a big part of me and how I grew up and where I come from. It's hard for me not to include my culture and my heritage. But sometimes when I have to focus on it, I focus on the the sacred aspect, the sacred perspective, and just to approach it with the absolute utmost respect. Because again, I can tell Navajo stories until the cows come home, but like they really do have. If I want them to really mean something, it all has to come from the heart, and coming from the heart, it has to come from where I come from and how I grew up. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that, Dale. I appreciate that very much. So there are two questions, and however, the current context that we've created is completely appropriate for my image to introduce it. So I'm just going to barrel forward with mine. And before I do, I'm going to put the frog image back on the screen, because part of what I study is contemporary theories of what, theories of what reality is. Okay. It's just called ontology. I'll just say that for now. And what was very exciting to hear about the frog image here is that it derives from reports of what it was like to be on the battlefield. So in a sense, from a traditional Western view, we might say, oh, the frogs were really there. In other words, in the West, we tend to make this big distinction between what's real and what's not real. And we tend to divide reality into a spiritual realm and a physical realm. Yet your description of the frog in this scene actually leads rather well to the frame that I picked, because, the issue of whether or not there's a bear there, right, which is what a traditional dualist Western take might be, is completely not the point. You introduce early on that Charlie is capable of being in multiple realms. In the West, we tend to think that one of those realms is real and the other isn't, right? And we tend to really break reality into this is real and that's not. My experience of indigenous ontology, though, is that there's an experience of being in multiple possible realms. It's just so difficult to talk about it in Western terms because we're convinced that it's not the case. We believe there's a thing called the earth and material world, and then there's a thing called heaven. And that tends not to be the way indigenous theories of reality or indigenous ontologies work. So not only do you have the nesting, what I mean is just putting all these things together. I mean, the story of World War I is just a big story all by itself. And then you put the conflict in there of these Native American men who were drafted to go to fight for a country, whatever that country is, that they're not sure they belong to. Yet I appreciated the different scenes of integration, or I'm not using that word positively. I'm just saying, wearing certain clothes, doing certain things in a certain way. And then now we have him running into another Native American that seems to be from a different tribe, yet they're both in sync on what's going on here. They both come from cultures of multiple realms. And I just thought that it added another layer to what was already a very dense relationship between Charlie and the world that he finds himself in. So I absolutely love this page, and I think it just added more complexity and more texture. And, in the West, we tend to call stuff like this magical realism, right? I mean, but the whole name is the problem. Right? There are people that dream worlds are not unreal, right? There are religious rituals of vision quests where you go find yourself in a space that some cultures may say that's not real, but that's not how those things are discussed or presented to children or raise children within. So I very much appreciated this further nesting of culture in the story, and found it fascinating that Charlie ran into someone else here who comes from a similar worldview, but not exactly his.
Yeah, thank you very much. Wow, I really appreciate all of your insights on these pages. And, we're using the English language, right? Which is
yes,
when you're trying to convey indigenous or, global perspectives, global cultural perspectives. And that's the beauty and power of art, right?
Yes.
The image, clearly spoke to you, right? In a way that allowed you to, I would say break out of the Western, construct and think about it in a global way, or even in an indigenous way.
Right.
And so, yeah, that other character is actually based on the real life Maidu man named Thomas Tucker, who was killed in action in the Maisha in the second day of the offensive. And growing up as a little boy, my grandpa, who was a combat decorated officer in World War II, would always tell me, you need to remember his name. And we have a photo of Thomas Tucker in our neighborhood on the reservation where I was raised, and it's black and white. And black and white conveys being in the past and being gone. As Native people, that's been problematic for us. It's problematic today. So I wanted to try and honor Thomas Tucker in color, number one, and then, like say, so Charlie sees him, and in the Maidu culture, which is my father's culture, we have a ceremony in the spring that honors the grizzly bear, and gives honors the bear because he's coming out of hibernation. And there's a ceremony where we hold the wormwood, and that's what the plant that the bear is holding in his left paw. And then I wanted to show the poignant part of, okay, in the war, the character's holding the rifle in his left hand, right? So again, what was Thomas Tucker being raised for culturally, and what was he being forced to do in the war? And there is loss attached to that, and there's trauma attached to that.
Mm.
And as Miss Orthy mentioned, that's happened around the world, right? It's happening now. And there's a loss and trauma. And how do people come out of that? And like Dale mentioned, his uncles, the Vietnam generation, I think the Vietnam era veterans are only just now probably going to maybe talk about their experience, because it's been 40 years or 50 years. When I interviewed my grandfather about his World War II experience, it had been 50 years. That's how long it took that generation to say, okay, I'll sit down and discuss and delve into these memories. So there's an element of, time that's involved in the healing, and just the human ability to, go back into those experiences. And again, that's the power, right, of graphic novels, right?
Absolutely.
So I appreciate that all of you are, we're all part of that. It's a healing journey. Graphic novels can be, fun and just, but every scene in this story has intention. I tried not to waste any panel, any space, which is why it took 3 years.
Right. No, I appreciate your comments on the utility. I'm going to use the word utility for the moment of graphic novels, because you don't say it, you show it. And you show it in ways that, as you said, provide people the opportunity to break through the ways of thinking that they've been raised in it up until now. And the advantage of a graphic novel, the advantage of an image like this is I'm not telling anybody what to think, right? I'm not sitting in my class and I'm telling you this is what you got to think, this is what this is. Rather, art starts a conversation. And when people are talking about images, they're a little less defensive, right? They're a little more open to talking about what an image is and what it might mean for them. And the trick is to get everybody in that space. I'm talking about classroom now, but get them in that space, freely expressing their diverse views on what this might mean, getting them in the middle of it and telling them, well, that's what everything is when it comes to conversations, when it comes to the laws we live by, when it comes by our daily habits. All of these things are negotiations, right? And if we're not negotiating, it's because we're being stubborn, right? And these graphic novels provide a way, particularly culturally informed graphic novels, provide a way to break through people's resistance or desire not to see, in ways that, like I said, lead to conversations kind of like this one. And of course, that's the evil scheme behind all of this, is to get these conversations started, and to perpetuate the lack of having to have the final answer, right? Just keep having a conversation, keep moving through it. All right, let's preach for just another second, and then I'll move on to questions here. But the conversation is just as real as any judgment you make. The conversation is just as real as any behavior you exhibit. So engaging in conversations and staying in them is actually a skill. Instead of clamming up and tell everyone they're wrong, learning how to just stay there in the ambiguity, and then being comfortable saying how you're experiencing at the moment is, dare I say, adult life. So look, we have two questions here. I'm going to throw them out to you. One is from AquaBaby62. AquaBaby62 was at ReggieCon last month. We appreciate you returning. And here is the question. What part of Cali is your family from? I think she's referring to you, Chag. My dad's native side is from Point area. My sister is an author out that way and a professor teacher out there. Did your family heritage help shape your desire to be an author? I'm working my way to being one as well.
That's great. I'm curious what the sister's name. probably would know her. It's a small world. Native life.
Well, they can tell us in the
Academia.
chat, and there you go.
Yeah, so
Yeah, exactly.
if you're there, Aqua, let me know. But I think comics and graphic novels, and Dale I'd be interested in your thoughts on this, but they're just another way to use sequential art that Indigenous people, we've always used sequential art to tell our stories, right? To convey why we're here, whether it's in our basketry, in our architecture, the language, the style of dress, the use of fire in the land relationship, that all conveys story and a sense of place. And so I was fortunate to be raised, on both sides of my family, knowing the history and knowing, cultural concepts and knowledge, because I had boarding school survivors on both sides of the family too. That whole structure was there to deny it and take it away. And so Dale, I'm curious, from your, from where you're from, how that helped you.
Say that one more time.
So just your culture and where you were raised, like how does that factor into your storytelling and your art?
I look at it this way. There's a lot of things around me that many of us take for granted that are related to what I do in terms of sequential art, storytelling, using pictures to tell a story. My father and I were looking through, this is when I was like, I want to say like 12 or 13 years old. My father and I were looking through this repair manual for his pickup truck, trying to figure out how to take out, the front axle of his 4x4 pickup, and, we were thumbing through all these pages, and I was looking at the pictures and then little captions beneath each picture describing how to remove these parts, And I told my dad at the time, well, hey, that's just like a comic book. He kind of shrugged it off, thinking, yeah, whatever. But I thought, but when I think about that memory, it's relative to a lot of things that we take for granted, that we don't think about, that are relative to sequential art or sequential or storytelling with pictures, And so when I relate that to culture, I think about a lot of the storytelling that took place, on the side of the mountain. I live a stone's throw from the Albuquerque petroglyph monument. So every now and then I'll take a walk out there just to kind of check it out, because these are stories being told with images. Right. So it goes back so far, and every culture can relate in some form or another. We can talk about everything from Stonehenge to the political comics in my local Navajo newspaper. And so it's all relative. And again, I'm going to go back to that thing where I was talking about everything comes naturally, to me, when it comes to using pictures to tell a story.
It's fantastic. Chag, could you do me a favor and open the chat at your end? Because Aqua Baby 62 gave you an answer, and I'd prefer that you read it, because
yeah, I met her.
No way.
Yeah, Point Arena, that's not that far from.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah,
could you pronounce that name for us, please? I'm sorry. Is Lowry?
Lowry, Liwa.
Liwa, okay, fantastic.
And that's the other thing. I think Native people, we were not static. Like, it blows my mind that we had Native people that went to France, for World War. Prior to that, our people were, travelers and, world travelers. And I have other stories, like I just did a sci-fi story, like where Native people are from. It's the Native version of Wakanda, right? And I have other stories, and I know Dale has awesome stories too. Like, we were all throughout history. We were everywhere, not just in these villages.
Right.
So I also think it's probably a unique opportunity for the universe to tell us that we should work together, Jake.
There you go.
Oh yeah, no, we will. That's always been my hope.
No, that's fantastic.
So and again, kind of coming from the place where, yeah, we've had all these stories since time immemorial, but they've been marginalized or suppressed.
Mm-hmm.
And I think pop culture can be used in a good way to educate. It has not been a good educator about Native people, in many ways, because that's where people they think they learn about us as Native people.
Right.
They saw a movie, and they saw a TV series, and up till now it's been very stereotypical. But so the beauty of knowing artists like Dale and other Washoyo Alvatre, who I work with, she's a dynamic. She's Tongva. We did a basketry comic. I highly recommend having her next year if you can. But we've got talented artists that, once we start talking, I'm sure Dale and I know a lot of people together, and that's a connector that that I think this country has always feared. The Native connective abilities to, know where we're from and who we are and why we're here, and that there's a lot of people afraid of that in life, right? There's a lot of people that love it. You guys obviously, love it and are in search of it, and it's a constant conversation, right? Like you say,
yes,
it's not always the answer, and I appreciated you that. Like I feel as an Indigenous creative person, we don't have to always answer the question. We don't have to always provide an image that just everybody understands, because I don't understand a lot of American society and culture, and nobody tells me about it. I just gotta I just gotta stumble through. So there's sometimes in my comic writing where I write just for Native people, and I know the Native person is gonna they're gonna say, that's it, that's me. And then a lot of people are gonna say, wait, what in the hell is it? They're just gonna, and that's okay. That's all okay. The other fascinating thing though that I've seen with the Soldiers Unknown book is I've talked to a lot of white guys who are Vietnam veterans. I've read the book and they're like, oh, this is my, that difficulty of coming home. That's what I've lived with for decades. So I hope that there's a universal aspect to, there's that struggle, and there's the physical return home, there's the mental return home, the emotional, the cultural, and that unfortunately, because I don't glorify war, or the military, but unfortunately we have that as a common thread globally.
No, I thought you did a fantastic job of letting the story be the story, right? Letting the people be the people that they were, and the war was a context in which they struggled to be. I quickly want to go back to your comment about you mentioned that we search for stories in ReggieCon. You're absolutely right, and there are some that don't. Quite often in a colonizing action, you'll find a destruction of the art and the language of the people that are being colonized, and that serves to destroy the ability to sustain that connectedness that you mentioned, right? So destroying language systems, destroying documents was a major part of the conquering of, the colonization of particularly South America, right? And destroying whole tomes of literature that were essential to sustaining those cultural groups. So that's not what we do here. We're very much interested in keeping everybody's story alive. As a matter of fact, the thing behind me says, "What's your story? What's your story?" And that's the point. So I have a student here. Her name is Renee Plank, and she's going to ask a question. It goes back to the frog. Renee, I know the moment to ask this question may have been when we had the frog image up, but I felt my bear image was like a direct follow-up, so I chose to go that way. But the question is, does the frog hand pattern symbolize something in general. But wishing the graphic novel, does it also symbolize Charlie finding comfort knowledge from his cultural roots and background? Like the example of him knowing that a frog would lead him to water out of the wastelands.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good, insightful couple of questions. Yeah, the frog hand symbol is often what I've been told is like it's friendship. It's a strong friendship, a mark of friendship. And, like on a basket, it would have been, maybe the basket would have been a cooking basket, shared, or a collecting basket, the design on here. So, I incorporated that concept, like she was sharing with him, like her ability to come out of no man's land. And I was always fascinated by, there are many World War I stories, where the Germans said, oh, they saw angels on the battlefield, or the British saw knights, in armor on the battlefield.
Yes.
And so there was that like surreal a whirlwind, a vortex of, culturally, people saw and experienced things. And I wanted to show that, same with the Yurok, same with any indigenous culture who had to fight and go through that. They were, no different. And so, and yeah, again, she was able to lead Charlie out of that. The Soldiers Unknown is it's kind of a male centric story, but I did try to, honor the women's perspective and the experience in that. And I think so I'll share my favorite page is the all black page after Charlie gets knocked out unconscious. And if you look at that black page, there's 7 points of light on it, and those signify there are 7 star sisters in Europe culture that go and they dance and they pray every night for the people. Yeah, there you go. So this is because you're all awesome. And I don't really share about this. It was something that I just put in there. But again, so those medicine women, they're the ones that brought Charlie back. Like Charlie would have died, but he didn't because they brought him. And then if you look on the cover of the book, the very cover on the upper right corner, you can see the 7 star sisters.
No, I'm going to make sure I can do this clearly. Yes, okay. They're right there.
Right
if I put it closer, you won't see it.
Yeah. So people, if you have the book, that was again to honor like who really is the strength. And it's always our Native women.
Right.
It's always the women in our community who handle everything. But that's not my story to tell. I can honor that as much as I can. And that's why at the end of the book, when Charlie is unconscious and he wakes up and he sees the angel in the window panes, and but what does he see? He sees a medicine woman, and I took that because there was a fascinating picture in the Meuse Argonne where these Americans used a bombed out, shattered church as a makeshift aid station. And in the back, there was a panel of, that showed some angel imagery. And I always remembered that. And I thought, if there's a way that I can incorporate that, but then also show from the Yurok cultural perspective, like what would we consider in seeing that? And so that's how that came out.
Yeah, I almost actually picked these 2 pages because you bring it back to the frog web pattern in the artwork there. Yeah. So, right. Any other questions or comments from anyone out there in the audience? Feel free to chime in. We're always interested in having further conversations.
I want to say something. because when I picked the frock trim, I did not think like that. I got the kind of like this magic realism in terms of lacking of good words. I'm using that. And when I saw the bear panel and the angel panel, but the fact that now that you explained the whole thing and how you wanted to like honor the Native women too, that kind of makes me like that kind of elevated my thought on the graphic novel to a different extent. It's amazing. It's really beautiful. I really appreciate this.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate, all of your insights. And yeah, like I'm going to create a World War II anthology, and maybe that's where you and I've thought about Vietnam too, because we have so many Vietnam veterans in our communities, and it's been, they're at that elder stage now. So it might be time to delve into that. Although Vietnam was so different from, World War II was the quote good war, right? And World War I was kind of like, well, what was that about?
Yeah, exactly.
Vietnam is like, that's a whole nother experience. But I think, sometimes as Native creators, we're going to create stories that are just, stories to create the story. But I think often we have these stories that we're compelled to share, like we're supposed to. So they're not vanity projects.
Right.
They're not just story. There's deep meaning behind it. And because it's taken so long for society in America to even acknowledge our indigenous perspectives, there's a lot out there. And I really appreciate, that you brought Dale and I on, because in this way, it's healing, right?
Yeah, it's our absolute pleasure.
Storytelling is healing, and that's the foundation of all health in any family, any culture, any community. You have to first be able to share your story.
Fantastic. Maisha's comment on developing a different understanding when you introduce the notion of what I'll call a Gaia myth, right? Indigenous ontologies tend to praise the feminine spirit. Women can create life, men can't, right? And so there are cultures that commit themselves to praising that role over the patriarchal view of the man as dominant. I'm just going to share this again because I got to say, when I saw this image for the first time, I didn't really go to Gaia. I didn't really go to, the divine feminine. I didn't go to that vibe. What I did go to was life. And this little frog is just alive. And it's so it like when you put that little frog in that image, you instantly start to despair to some extent for the young man, because it's like, I'm so far away from life, right? Not just life in terms of in my body, but life in terms of everything I live in, everything that my actions create on a daily basis. And all this killing is not something that I experience creating. And it's just a little teeny frog there, just, says, man, we are not in the right place. And it just really makes for him, I felt extremely alone. Even though the frog is carrying him to water, it's still, I'm all alone here. And I'm all alone in a world that doesn't make sense in terms of who I am and what I've ever done. So again, another interpretation. I'm sure if we talked about it for another 20 minutes, we'd have another one. But I absolutely love it. And I absolutely love that this is what I'm going to say, good graphic novels, if I may. This is what good graphic novels do, is they provide this kind of continuing conversation, as opposed to, we've never really had a creator come on here and say, no, you're all wrong. This is exactly what I meant, right? They let the art be the art. And they let us talk about it and continue the conversation. So any final questions from the audience, or any final questions or comments from the panel?
I point out one thing?
Please do.
Could you bring up the image of the bear again?
Yes, absolutely.
In full disclosure, and I apologize, I have not had a chance to read this graphic novel yet. I just don't have it. And with the Red Planet store closing here in Albuquerque, a lot of these books are hard to come by. But let me share some thoughts on this page as an artist as opposed to a storyteller. There's an element of rawness that's included here. You can see the sketch lines and all the figures. You can see where the artist began and where the artist finished. You know, you can see where there's heavy detail and there's minimal detail, and it's all in my view. There's a perfect balance that's taking place in every single element of these pages. And when I look at this spread, there's a duality included too, because there's balance not just in one page, but there's a balance in the spread. And so culturally, there's a lot of stress and importance placed on balance, you know. So whenever there's chaos taking place on one side of like the spirit world or the real world, you know, there's organization taking place on the other side. You know, there's this magical process that takes place where nature just kind of helps balance everything out. And so looking at this spread, you know, I can see how the artist really just sort of, just like you said earlier, danced in two different worlds. You have the beginning portion of every single element on this page, and you also see the finished process, you know, to the inking phase, or to the colors, you know, to the lettering, you know. And I find it remarkable in that this presentation lends itself to the intensity of the story that's taking place. Does that make any sense? Could we go back to the frog image?
Of course. Let me make sure I get there the right way. All right. There you go. Go ahead.
Now, to me, what's beautiful about this page is that, you know, from the outside observer, none of this is making any sense, you know. But culturally, we know exactly what's happening because there's an animal that's that could be construed as being a trickster, and that's not a whole other rabbit. That's a whole other rabbit hole that we can go down later. But the frog, the female frog especially, represents, you know, to a lot of people who are with indigenous origin, it sort of represents a grounding to nature, a grounding to Mother Earth, a grounding to, you know, family and spiritual health, you know. So I see a sort of funnel action where there's all of this mess of chaos happening, but then the female frog comes along and anchors this person back to where they're supposed to be in their head and in their body, and then leading that person to where life can continue. You know, so culturally, this strikes a chord with me, even though I didn't even read the book. You know, it's amazing how we can still find that connection with these stories. And I gotta say, the artwork, just from what I see here, is absolutely remarkable. And I really need to get my hands on this book and have Chag sign it for me.
Chag, did you want to respond to that at all?
Oh, thank you. That was very beautiful. You know, your insights, and yeah, I think, you know, it's a universal theme and journey. Everybody wants to be part of something larger than themselves, right? And when you are violently yanked out of that, like these men were, out of their culture, out of their home, how do you go back? And that's the universal struggle for veterans, regardless of culture, I think, and even regardless if they saw combat or not, because you're still taken out of your home, you're still somewhere else, you're still reconditioned and re-educated. And so the challenge is, how do you return? And can culture help? And I think, can ceremony help? And ceremony can be many, you know, that's a big term, right? It's not just religious. There's many things can be ceremony. And there are, like you say, you know, there are many items in a culture or in a family. You know, a lot of people, if somebody said, well, here's my Bible, my family Bible, well, that means something, right? There's story, history attached to that. somebody says, here's my piece of regalia that I used, my headpiece in the jump dance, and that's the cover of the book. Well, there's story there and there's meaning there, right? If a woman says, here's the basket that I created and here's the designs. So, I'm very proud, that, my grandpa's generation, my uncle was in Vietnam, and a lot of veterans in my family, but it's also very poignant. There's also a lot of sorrow and loss attached to that unique sacrifice that Native people have given for the sovereignty of the United States of America, right? And how do we help? How do we heal? And how do we return?
Yep.
And again, I will always look at artists like Dale and Wishoyo and all the others. They're the ones who can envision that healthy pathway back. The artists, the poets, the singers. They're the ones that have it. We just need to listen. And then the very last thing, like that I'll say, in terms of war and in terms of and just looking at what's going on now today, like there is an imbalance, and that's because women need to be in charge more. I honestly, culturally, that's, in California, our cultures are matriarchal traditionally, and we need to return to that. And until we do on a global scale,
right?
Come on, us, guys, we've kind of had our chance, don't you think? But we need to get back into that balance, and women as decision makers. And they always say, the mothers would stop war, right? Because mothers are the ones that hurt the most. Fathers too. But that's something that I'd like to end with too, and that's why those Star Sisters are so meaningful to me, because they're the ones.
Chag, I'd love to be able to end on that wonderful statement. At the end, however, Renee threw another question at you. So this is for Chag and Dale. Are there other Native communities that you continue to learn from? I'm a Chicana, and there's so many different subgroups of Hispanic and Latin heritage that I feel like I always learn more from. So I was wondering if there are other differences between communities that are different from subgroup to subgroup, but still make up the overarching culture that inspire both of you in your work. That's for both of you.
Absolutely. I have several friends who live in downtown Los Angeles, and they're of Hispanic descent, Hispanic and Latino descent. And we share a lot of commonalities in terms of having to navigate Western society, through just recently we've had a discussion talking about trying to find healthcare. We're all, because this group that I belong to, we're all a bunch of artists just trying to make a living for ourselves, so we bounce projects together. So it's amazing how we can all make the same kind of jokes, in our own language. We make the same jokes, but it hits everyone the same way. So the more I learn about the commonalities that American-based of this continent, the cultures that are based in this continent, there's so many similarities between us that the more that I learn about that, the more surprised I become. And honestly, the closer I get, so it's amazing to me that we found a way to exist in the same space.
Yeah, I agree, and I always enjoy the conversations between cultures, and indigenous is everywhere, right? Indigenous, we all come, go back far enough from villages, from certain, specific places, and yeah, I enjoy, learning from other cultures, but then the great thing, like Lee Francis did, is he created the Indigenous Comic Con. That's where I met Wishoyo and Dale. So to have the opportunity to meet and be amongst each other is very key and significant too. And it's the same for us nerds, right? Where do
Yes.
us comic book nerds get to go? Thankfully, I think we're kind of in a golden age right now, right? It's much
Yes.
more accepted now than back in the mid 80s, right? When
Right.
I was the only one that went to the comic book rack and
Mm.
picked up the Wolverine and Detective comics, right? There was, maybe one other friend, but boy, he hit it, right? But
Mm.
now we're like out in the open, right? That's a great
Mm.
thing.
Yeah, geek culture truly is driving some of the more sophisticated conversations we're having as a culture right now. I know that Eric and I go to a lot of Comic Cons and we do a lot of panels. And when we're talking at those events, we don't talk in the jargon of psychology, and yet if we can't find a way to relate it to real life, why are we doing it in the first place? Right. So, yeah, in partaking in what people will call geek culture has been an absolute circular process for me, coming back to myself as a young kid, watching cartoons, loving them, and then suddenly finding out that Full Metal Alchemist is probably one of the best stories ever written, right? And talking to people about why. This fantastic stuff. And so I very much appreciate you guys coming to the show tonight and sharing your thoughts with us. I want to wind it down here. I want to first thank Eric for showing up tonight. Appreciate you being here, buddy. Maisha, thank you so much for being here. It's always a pleasure to have you on ReggieCon. And Dale, thank you so much for sharing your insights. Absolute blast hearing the things you had to tell. You're more than welcome. And special thanks to Chag, right, for showing up and, talking to us about this very intimate graphic novel that speaks to everything as well as himself. We very much appreciate your willingness to share that with us.
Thank you so much. I appreciate all of you. Hope to see you at a Comic-Con one day.
Yeah, absolutely. That would be great. Before we sign off, we once again want to thank the people behind the scenes doing all that work that makes us look like we know what we're doing. So best to everyone out there. Thank you for coming. Have a good evening.